We're in the year of 2023. If we follow the news closely, China, one of the largest economies in the world today, again, is gaining more attractions than ever. Given the fact that recently the French President Emmanuel Macron paid a short visit to this nation, on one hand, some people argue that Macron achieved his goals during his visitation to China. But on the other hand, other people are arguing that Macron made a mistake by visiting China. Well, what gives? But meanwhile, more international diplomats are on their way. And how about the current president of Brazil, Lula? He's also scheduled to visit China, given the fact the two countries recently sealed a $30 million bill currency swap agreement. Now, that could elevate this relationship between Brazil and China to the next level. And how about the relationship between the two countries at this moment? Well, in this episode, we are going to talk about regarding the ongoing relationship between China and Brazil, and also eventually we will talk about the relationship between France and China, and also some of the European allies at this moment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you follow our show, you should be familiar with one of our distinguished speakers, which is Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and focusing on international law, international relations, and Brazil, and he's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. Well, Dr. Marcus, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Very good to talk to you today, Will, and congratulations on everything that you're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Marcus. Now, I want to get started. As we mentioned before, recently, Brazil and China sealed such an economic large package, which worth $30 billion, which is the currency swap agreement between the two countries. Now, help us to understand what is the significance of such a deal, and how does that boost the relationship from this economic perspective between the two countries?
I think that over the last few years, we have seen China engaging in a process of slowly replacing the dollar as the world currency and the world reserve currency and the world transaction currency. And we know that in order to do that, you have to gain confidence in the currency. You have more people to adopt your currency and have more confidence in the value and in the policies that are implemented to keep its value. So for since the late 40s, the dollar has been actually the major currency in the whole process, and that has given the Americans an enormous advantage when it comes to a series of things. Of course, China is trying to replace it, but it has to do that in a slow way, because China also owns a lot of U.S. dollar treasury bills and all that, and you do not want the dollar to devalue because it would be troublesome for the whole world. But we do see this movement of the RMB gaining more and more weight, and particularly considering that China is the number one trading partner for more than 140 countries and territories, it becomes an easier thing for countries to start doing transactions in yuan and even paying each other in yuan. So you see that the process that the Chinese have designed for making their currency the world reserve currency or a world reserve currency is certainly by trade, which is very essential nowadays, and countries look forward to that. Now, it's interesting that Brazil was one of the big countries to adopt this kind of relationship with China, because for the longest time, and we have said that before, Will, Brazil has always treated China as a client, not as a partner. And I think that, if Brazil were to join the Belt and Road Initiative and, using the currency swap more frequently and more intensively, I think that we can actually take the relationship to the next level. The current bilateral relationship is around $300 billion. I think that, by starting doing this, we can actually move that to a much higher level, because one of the things that is interesting is that the economies of Brazil and China, they are not competitors, but they're complementary. And there's a lot of things that China can do in Brazil when it comes to infrastructure and, buying more Brazilian products and all that. So I think that this is a good beginning, and this is a good sign that this president, Lula, is actually engaging in. And I think it's something that needs to be congratulated. I disagree on several other points of his foreign policy, but this is certainly the most important relationship Brazil has. And I think that one of the reasons why we might see positive results in all this, is because the visit that President Lula had with President Biden in the United States was a little frustrating for him. So he was expecting something else, and I think that he's placing a whole lot more bets in China. And remember that in his first term, China actually saved the economy of Brazil at the time because of the intense growth of the Chinese trade with Brazil, and that had a major positive impact in the country. So he realizes that China is an important player. That is his third visit, and I think that I hope that new agreements will come out of this.
Well, Dr. Marcus, again, when we look at this economic initiative between the two countries, now recently, just before our interview, and another term that started to pop up is called China's de-dollarization initiative. Again, we know that today, since the year of 2011, it's not just with the country of Brazil, but with many other countries that China started to build or initiated such economic a relationship with the countries. But meanwhile, by understanding the relationship with Brazil or with Armenia or any other countries, that could pose major significant economic threat, for example, to the West and to the United States of America. Now, Dr. Marcus, at this moment, based on what China has done with the country of Brazil and also other countries, do you think that this China's de-dollarization initiative should be concerning for the West? If so, what are the ways that for the U.S. or for any other countries to counter or to balance the relationship with the countries that China had already solidified or strengthened the relationship? What do you say to that?
Now, I wrote a paper a few years ago on the RMB and the process that the RMB was slowly replacing the dollar. We consider the dollar to be the world currency because the United States for a long time has had low inflation rates. The government has been behind the currency, and Americans tend to comply with the contracts that they agree. So these are the three major factors why people trust the dollar and they rely on the dollar, right? But there have been some situations in which the dollar has been abused. Like we have seen quantitative easing policies that were used by President Bush at the time. We have seen, the use of the dollar for sanctions and trade difficulties that have been created. So the U.S. has somehow abused the power that it has gained through the dollar. And you have to remember that, right after the war, the dollar was the currency that was mostly transacted in the world. Now, looking into the U.S. participation of world GDP, we see that the United States basically represents 17% of the world economy, while the dollar is 40% of the transactions, so it's twice as much. But the EU has, through the euro, tried to replace the dollar in their transactions. Now, the euro had a very hard time during the 2008 crisis, and people were very skeptical about the euro, but has somehow consolidated and become like a really currency that people use in their transactions and trunk contracts and all that. But China has decided that it made sense for China to do the same thing with the yuan. Now, the strategy that China had it was different from what the Americans did because China didn't have a world war where all the competitors were destroyed. So China has done this in an amazing way and through trade. which is historically what China does best. China has always been a country, and we have seen. And I always remember that to my students and everywhere that I have the opportunity to talk. You have to remember that in the old Silk Road, it was actually products from China getting moved to Europe and not the other way, right? Because China has always had this tradition in commerce, and China has done this process of de-dollarization of the economy through trade and by becoming the number one trading partner, as I said to you before, to several countries. So you have that positive aspect. And one thing that also is really a sign, and we have to see the signs as they happen. I remember that a few years ago, many journalists and many newspapers writers said that China, the yuan, the RMB, would only become one of the currencies in the IMF basket, which comprises the dollar, the yuan, the euro, the yen, the euro. It would take 10 or 15 years for China to be one of the currencies that is part of the SDR, right? The special drawing rights of the IMF. And everybody was saying 15 to 20 years, and China did that in 5 years. So if people haven't realized how China has moved in a very effective way in this process, they really are not keeping track of what's going on around the world. So it is something also that there is a demand. But the dollar has been guaranteed also by the fact that we negotiate in dollars when we buy oil. So with the war in Ukraine, perhaps with Russia becoming more closer to China, you see that China is paying the Russian oil with RMBs. And I think that the peace agreement or the agreement that China has worked on in Saudi Arabia might also show a sign that in the future, those two major powerhouses in oil exports could actually start accepting RMBs for transactions. And that would be a major shift in the whole thing. So I think that the dollar has deteriorated in its power over the last few years because of the erroneous erroneous way that Americans have abused the power of the currency, and that it will get tired after a little while, and they want to seek alternatives.
Dr. Marcus, again, today when we talk about the economic change or any economic shift, we can't talk about this economic change without bringing any geopolitical shift as well. But meanwhile, the fact is both China and the Brazil, and also you mentioned Russia, all of the countries are also included in one of the major powerhouse, which is called BRICS. Now, Dr. Marcus, at this moment, by growing closely, economically speaking, for China, for Russia, for Brazil, how much do you think that could actually benefit this powerhouse in general? And how do you think that we should understand this economic partnership between Brazil and China, or between Brazil and Russia? And again, within this powerhouse, how much do you think that it actually generate more by building much closer economic ties?
Well, I think that in a way, you will see that the old arrangements that we have in the West, of the G7, for instance, it's not, I won't say that the G7 is dead or something like that, because people always like to say this thing and they always get it wrong, right? The G7 congregates the 7 largest economies in the world. The issue is that the G7 is a closed club. It's not open. And even if China wanted, it's not going to be a member, because the last one who was a member was Russia, and it was kicked out, right? When the G7 turned out to be G8 and they wanted to include Russia. But we have seen also that the countries that have participated in the G7 meetings, and South Africa being the one that has participated the most really haven't had a major positive impact in their economies. So what we realize here is that the G7 structure is one that is not really going to be helping the world change. And then basically it is also preservation of the status quo, the situation as it is. And the more I travel through Europe, and where, we have many of the countries that are part of the G7, you do see that many of them are leaving out of the legacy from the past. No disruptive technologies, no new entrepreneurial spirit or something else going on, right? Which is you need to be always creative, and you always need to be competitive, and you need always to be on the edge. You do not see that happening in many of the G7 countries, which is a challenge for them. Now, on the other hand, you have the BRICS, right, which is a term that was coined by a Goldman Sachs economist at the time, Jim O'Neill, and the whole thing is that nobody ever thought that this could actually become some sort of arrangement. And I read today in one of the newspapers in China that you're saying that we're starting the golden years, or the second decade, the second golden decade of the BRICS. And I think that that's true. China has consolidated its position as a world power. India is on that way. We do have the problems with Russia and the way the Russians have dealt with this situation in Ukraine, and that's a challenge to international law and international organizations. And China has really mentioned that is a problem, right? And according to the paper that was released by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but we do see that this arrangement is looking by the countries that have requested to join. It shows that it's a little bit more open and a little bit more willing to take others, like the G7 was never willing to do. So I think that this open arrangement is an important thing, and as we rebuild global governance, because it doesn't make sense for you to have some countries with so much power. And while these new economies, these rising economies, should have more of a say in global governance and in the world status. Now, I think that Brazil, my country of origin, still needs to understand the power of this shift in global governance. I do have my own restrictions on who we appointed to be the president of the new development bank. But I think that Brazil needs to learn and understand how important this new arrangement is, and consider also a very important factor is that we are actually sitting on the negotiating table. And we always learn one thing that we say, you can be somebody who makes the orders, or you can be somebody who takes the orders, right? I think that not the G7, but the BRICS allows Brazil to be in the room and not outside the room waiting for the orders to be taken. And I think that's an important thing and we need, from time to time, the world needs to have some renewal of new ideas, and we need to have some disruptive strategies and disruptive events so that we can actually do something that is going to be more relevant.
As we mentioned before, Dr. Marcus, the current president of Brazil, Lula, is set to visit China this week. Now, you're the expert. Again, you mentioned this during the numerous occasions that Brazil is not a partner, but meanwhile, Brazil is a client for China. So what are the expectations that, from your perspective, during the exchange between the current president of Brazil and also the Chinese leader this week?
I think it would be ideal, really, if Brazil were to join the Belt and Road Initiative, right? That would be something that would basically allow Brazil to enhance the relationship with China. Now, I know that the Brazilian president is traveling with a group of business people who, some of them have been there for almost 2 weeks, waiting for, who were waiting from the previous trip that was supposed to take place and never happened. But what I find out is that, many of these people are in the agricultural sector and all that. And the only fear I have is that there is still many people talking about issues related to the environment, and which are very important. Don't take me wrong, But what I think here, which is something that is essential in my viewpoint, is that Brazil needs to build infrastructure. We need to have new ports, airports, we need new roads. And even, for a long time, we have been dreaming about the possibility of having an access to the Pacific Ocean, right? But the funds are never there, and the infrastructure is never there. So I think that we should really partner up with China in the building of this enormous possibility that Brazil needs to have in order to grow its economy. I'm always remember that statement that he have in China, that saying that he have in China, build a road and get rich, right? Which I think is truly one of the essential factors for you to grow. You need to build the infrastructure. And I think that if President Lula were to emphasize this issue in the visit, I think that would be, one of the most important items and a legacy in the relationship between the two countries. And now other things, sustainable development and all these kind of issues are important. But what really matters now is how Brazil will deal with its own need to grow economically. 40 years ago, not 40 years ago, in 1978, when reform and opening up in China started, the Brazilian economy was 10 times larger than the Chinese economy. The Brazilian GDP per capita was 10 times bigger than the one you had in China. And now we're smaller. So the Chinese have done something right, and we have done something very, very wrong to get into that kind of situation. And the only way for this government to work out well is to have economic growth. Now, China really saved President Lula's first time by providing the necessary economic growth that the country needed at that time. And that's how he got elected, and he was able to elect, his successor and all that. Now, I think that, we should look into China also as this, not savior, but this very important player in that sense. So I think that by treating China not as a client, but as a partner in which we can build this new world order, this new global governance in ways that will be more, as China says, will ensure more cooperation and more shared values and a more shared future. I think that this could be the beginning of something really good. Now, the previous government had an ideological blockage against China. Right now, they have this in ideological blocking against China, and I hope that this government will not have like an intellectual blocking against China, and will understand the many possibilities that we can build together.
Dr. Marcus, again, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's shift our attention to the recent visit initiated by the current president of France, Emmanuel Macron, that he also paid a short visit to China. Now, given the fact that today, when we look at China's rise, Russian aggression, and weakening of democracy, global warming, technology, regulation, put everything together, as I mentioned in the intro, some people believe that Macron made a mistake by going to China because when he came back, he was actually empty-handed. But meanwhile, other people argue that Macron made a tremendous political progress by trying to convince China to make bigger step or maybe significant impact on Russia in terms of war in Ukraine. So briefly, Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, how should we evaluate Macron's trip this time to China? And also keep in mind, domestically speaking, this political chaos is also falling on the shoulder of Macron right now. So what do you say to that, Dr. Marcus?
Well, we say that when presidents have problems at home, they enjoy traveling, right? Because that is the moment when they can actually, for 1 week or for a few days, get out of the situation and be able to breathe. And France has many problems, as we know, with this issue of the retirement age. It's been like several weeks where we have people manifesting themselves on the street. And I recall I was in Toulouse. I teach in Toulouse too, early March, and I recall that people are not very happy with Macron. He got reelected, but he's only got 25% support, which is very low for a president that still has 4 years to go. So it is an issue and it's a concern for him. But what we realize, though, Will, is that France has always had somehow mixed feelings about the relationship with the United States. And when it comes to the European countries, one could actually say that France is the only one, defense-wise, that is not dependent on the United States to do things. There are no military, as far as I know, there are no military bases from the United States located in France. While if you look into Germany, the UK, Portugal, everyone else has it. So that kind of reduces your freedom to decide things. And I think that because of that, France is always trying to play at a different league and try to keep the relevance of the country internationally. And I think that Macron comes within that spirit of, keeping France great again, or making France great again, in a sense that he is trying to make France play a role that he hasn't played for a long time. It does play a role within the European Union and all that, but France, because of the colonies, because of the history and all that, always considered itself to be an important player in the world. Remember, there was Napoleon that said, "Let China rest, because the day China wakes up, it will shake the world." There was a French guy who said that. And I think that Macron perhaps have finally understood that the world has shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that China is the new kid on the block with major strength. And it made sense for them to, for France and the European Union to forge a new relationship with China and not buy into the American, American allegations of against China and all the shaming that sometimes the United States does against China. So I think that Macron has realized that, and that's why he even said that they need to rethink their relationship with the United States. First thing that they need to do is to stop calling China a rival. I think that would be an important thing for the Europeans to start doing if they want to build a relationship that is positive in the long run. But overall, I think there was a score. It was a point for Macron in relation to the other leaders that you have in Europe. But it's a challenging situation because domestically, he's only got 24% support, and people don't realize that all the benefits that could derive from such a change in foreign policy.